Hark! It's an 87th Precinct podcast side pod. This is the only podcast in the world dedicated to Ed McBain's seminal series of police procedural stories, which began in 1956 with Cop Hater and ended in 2005 with Fiddlers. But that's not all. Ed McBain also wrote under a wide variety of other names and in many different genres, so today we'll be looking at one example of that side of his creative output. My name's Paul Abbott, and joining me today is the person who was our first ever guest on the podcast back in November 2017, discussing the Star Trek episode Assignment Earth. This is my good pal, the illustrator, Adam Paxman.
Hello!
Welcome back, Adam.
Welcome to the world of tomorrow!
Appropriate. So what's been going on with you since November 2017?
2 years of
Fill us in.
baby. I have a baby now, a 5-month-old baby, and that has completely changed my life. He's wonderful, but even getting here across town today proved to be challenging.
Well, I'm glad you made it anyway. So I could describe you as an illustrator there, but you've probably not picked up a pen for 5 months.
I've not
more.
picked up a pen or pencil with the intention of making a mark for many moons now. Yeah.
Oh well, it'll come back eventually. I don't know when. I can't make any promises. But let's get on to today's topic then. It is something very specific. It's not a general thing. It is a specific episode of TV. It's the first ever piece of work that the author had adapted for television, or wrote for television, which is what I believe it is, rather than adapted. So credited to his birth name, which was S.A.Lombino, Salvatore Albert Lombino. This is a half hour of science fiction television. It's one episode of the anthology TV series Tales of Tomorrow, and it's called Appointment on Mars.
Not Apartment on Mars.
No.
As some people on the internets would have you believe.
Well, people on the internet are very nice if they're listening to this, and if not, they're fools. Well, can we just, before we get going, I know you've been on the show before talking about sci-fi stuff with me.
That's correct.
But let's establish your sci-fi credentials. Why would I want you on this show to talk about something in an anthology sci-fi series?
Well, I own all 5 seasons of the original Twilight Zone on Blu-ray. I'm a huge fan of science fiction in literature, television and film, bit of a film buff, and yeah, huge Star Trek fan, and obviously that's why you recruited me last time.
Yeah, and you like the film Forbidden Planet, which is relevant to today's content.
I've seen Forbidden Planet a couple of times.
More than once, I warrant.
Wonderful seminal piece of sci-fi filmmaking. Influential sci-fi filmmaking, Forbidden Planet, yeah.
Now, I don't think this episode of Tales of Tomorrow is exactly seminal or influential, but I think it's significant in some ways. It's certainly significant for S.A.Lombino / Evan Hunter / Ed McBain. So if I just give our dear listeners a bit of a breakdown on what we're talking about, a bit of the background facts. So this half-hour episode of TV was first broadcast on the 27th of June, 1952, and the writing credit is by S.A.Lombino. It was part of the Tales of Tomorrow anthology series, directed by Don Medford, produced by Mort Abrahams, broadcast live, as the entire series was, and many TV series, on ABC. And, as I said before, it was Lombino / Hunter's first TV credit ever. First ever acted version of any of his stories. It's also his only science fiction credit for TV, despite the fact that he wrote loads of sci-fi short stories. So it was broadcast on the 27th of June 1952. He'd actually legally changed his name to Evan Hunter in May of 1952, but presumably this was made or written before then and submitted before then. We know it wasn't produced before then because it went out live. So he was already Evan Hunter by the time this went out on air. And I can't find anything more about it in the various records of his career, his talking about it, his list of his archives and things like that. There's no reference to this episode in there at all.
Yeah, just from my very scant research, which will pale into significance compared to yours, Paul, and I realised that it would. when you Google this, when you do a superficial internet search, there's just a few websites and blogs discussing it, generally giving a bit of a review or a synopsis. I tried to track down a screenplay, and all I found was a transcript taken from the broadcast itself, and with several inaudible descriptors.
Well, that's just before you continue. That's a good point. This is available to watch online. Okay. Lots of the Tales of Tomorrow were fortunately kept as telecine recordings. So, and also they're out of copyright now, so they are available on YouTube. If you want to download a better quality version, you go to archive.org. So this is a watchable episode, so we're not just talking about something in abstract here. We have seen this a few times between us now.
That's right. I watched it a few weeks ago when you suggested it, and then we've watched it again today. And certainly the version I watched on YouTube was quite muffled and lower resolution than the one we watched today. So I would recommend you. The archive copies, definitely.
Yeah, so I haven't got much trivia around this relating to the author particularly, but I can put it into context. I've extracted basically the information about what he'd written by this point. So, as I say, this is his first TV credit, so there's nothing before that. In terms of his output as a writer, we've only got 7 entries to his name at this point. We've got a short story called Reaching for the Moon, which was November 1951. A story called Fury on First in December of 51. I'm giving away all my research here. There's two novels. One's called The Evil Sleep, which is a Evan Hunter novel. Find the Feathered Serpent, which is his first kids sci-fi novel. And then there's another detective story. There's 2 more sci-fi stories, and that's it. So he's only had 7 things published and made available to the public with his name, or variations on his name. He's basically S.A.Lombino, Hunt Collins, and Evan Hunter are the names he's used up to this point. No Ed McBain yet. That doesn't come for a few years.
When you mentioned Find the Feathered Serpent, because I looked up some sci-fi that he'd written, and there's some, I suppose, what we'd call now young adult or kind of general audience with children in mind as well. And Find the Feathered Serpent was there, and the name inspired me to look up whether that was connected to the TV series, the later TV series, The Feathered Serpent, which was mentioned when we went to an evening of about Scarred for Life.
Oh, yes.
The book Scarred for Life. But I couldn't make out whether there was any
I think the connection
to that.
It's just the historic figure of the
mythological,
Feathered Serpent. But which I think is a Aztec Mexican thing. I will be doing an episode about the book Find the Feathered Serpent with my brother. He will be returning to complete the trilogy of Ed McBain's juvenile sci-fi stories very soon, I hope. But the fact that this comes out under the name S.A.Lombino is interesting. Some sources on the internet say that this is actually an adaptation of a short story, or it was adapted into a short story later, and they quote that it's the story What Price Venus, which appeared in Fantastic Universe magazine in August of 1953. And in fact, there's a book called Vintage Science Fiction, which is all about stories that inspired famous film and TV episodes, and it's included in that, and that was done in the mid-90s. I think it's rubbish. I don't think this story, What Price Venus, has anything to do with this whatsoever. Because 1, Venus, not Mars. 2, it was published a year later, over a year later.
Yeah, broadcast, yeah.
And 3, I've read it, and it's got nothing to do with the story, other than it's some Earthmen on another planet.
Yeah, which is a fairly standard setup.
And lots of his stuff is about Earthmen on other planets. Yeah, it really, if you try and wrap your head around the idea that it's a variation on a theme, it's not. That story's not at all. So I poo-poo anyone who says What Price Venus is an adaptation of Appointment on Mars, or the other way around. I did find a story that was published again in late 1953 called Outside in the Sand, which at least does feature a man from Earth going mad on Mars whilst lots of wind is blowing and howling, and ends up with him...
That does sound reminiscent, yeah.
Ends up in him in conflict with his crewmates. But again, it's not the same story, but it's closer than the other one is anyway.
That does sound... Yeah, that's far closer to what happens in the story of... Well, spoilers... of Appointment on Mars.
Yeah. I found one thing in the Washington Post from the day it was broadcast, which was basically the TV listing for the episode, except they called it Flight to Mars.
Okay.
Which suggests more of an element of it being about the actual journey rather than appointment on Mars, which suggests diaries? I don't know.
Yeah, it is an odd title anyway. An appointment with someone or with something? Not clear.
Well, we'll get into that. So, Tales of Tomorrow, the series that it's part of anyway, was broadcast on ABC from 1951 to 1953. They managed 85 episodes.
Wow.
All of 30 minutes long. And it had a more of an adult slant than a lot of other shows, sci-fi shows, which is why the adverts in the middle of it and at the end of it are for carpets rather than toys and games or whatever.
The advertising is amazing, actually, as a slice of Americana at that time. And from working in a graphic design illustration background, it's really quite interesting to see how honest and frank and direct advertising was on television at that point compared to some of the production costs and things we see now, and the very extravagant narratives at Christmas around this season. Interesting stuff.
It is always nice to see a bit of archive TV with the archive advertising in place around it. And this is because this anthology series was presented by this advertiser, this carpet company. So it's not even that it's like it stops, then they show adverts, then it starts again. It stops so the sponsor can say, well, we'll carry on in a second, but first let me tell you about carpets.
That's right. And it's something that appears on the Twilight Zone, which, as we've said, came later. There would be Rod Serling announcing a piece of advertising for an alternate sponsor. So when you're talking about a half hour of television in 1952 or slightly later, you're really looking at two pieces of advertising for the same company, or possibly for only two companies. Compare that to half an hour of of television, episodic television now, and look at how many bits of advertising you're constantly being bombarded with. And if it's something like like a Love Island or a not Strictly Come Dancing, because that's on the BBC.
I'm strictly a celebrity.
Yes,
let me be on this island.
If there's a jungle related one, and the amount of synergized products and things and soundtracks that come out as part of a sort of advertising and merch bundle is really quite interesting. Completely different to what you get with
1952.
this.
It's just intense carpets advertising.
And I tried to write down as we watched it some of the terms that are used for explaining and describing to the audience those carpets. And I just had to give up because it was so thick with it was almost as thick as the carpets themselves. The the deep pile.
That's a more snappy sort of line. They'd have killed for that line in 1952.
It's an incredibly honest and frank and just descriptive way of advertising something as simple as a carpet. And as you pointed out, Paul, it being broadcast in black and white, one of the great jokes is that actually they, which is not intended as a joke in the advert, is that they actually have colour swatches and they describe them. And even one of the colours that they do mention is grey, which is just wonderful.
Which shade of grey would you like for your carpet? Would you like grey? Well, it was like, this comes in some fantastic colours, such as grey, beige,
cream, and beaver.
Beavers are native to the UK, but they're not very widely native to the UK. I couldn't tell you what colour a beaver actually was. Is it brown?
Brown.
Sort of brown?
It's a brown.
I'd go for brown.
It's brown.
And let's not talk any more about beaver colour at this point.
Or carpets.
Oh, well, I'm sure we'll crop up again. Let's basically... let me tell you a little bit about the setup and the cast. It's a 3-person cast with a couple of voiceover people involved as well at some point. It's shot studio-based. It's a sci-fi story, and the simple basic principle is 3 men from Earth have gone, funded by a mining company, to go to Mars to check for mineral deposits. And that's why these 3 people are on Mars, and we start with them on Mars. They've landed, they've unpacked, and they've got a job to do, which is basically go looking for mineral deposits.
Yeah,
and
it's very much a tale of blue-collar workers. I think the dialogue reflects that. The way they talk is not corporate. It begins actually with almost a game kind of being quite grab-ass and childish and boyish.
Yeah.
There's even a moment very early on where one of the characters starts to talk vaguely in a scientific way and is told, enough of that, professor.
Yeah.
So that's not the kind of story that they want to tell. It's very much actually in genre, I guess you could say it's a prospecting movie.
Definitely.
It's about that frontier. This could be the before a gold rush, if you like, the first people to get onto this this strip of land, irrespective of it being on Mars, and the fact that they have pistols is something that's picked up by a few people on the internet. Again,
yes, not lasers,
but they have pistols with them. They have weapons, but that's true of the Age of Discovery, Captain Cook, all of these types of stories, and of course they're going to be relevant later. In this specific story, but it's very relevant to that kind of sense of human exploration where you do go with something to defend you.
Well, I think what's interesting, you saying that, is that S.A.Lombino, Salvatore Lombino, Evan Hunter, by this point, he had been in the Navy, but he was from, he was a shit kicker from New York, from the Bronx for a while at this point. He'd been in basically Italian Harlem, then the Bronx. He'd been in the Navy, so that was his travel. So he'd seen camaraderie, he'd seen what it was like to be aboard ship and see that sort of stuff. But if you think about what people like about his books, particularly the Ed McBain books, it's his dialogue and it's his human behaviour. I'm not suggesting this is an example of the best of it. It's not by any means, but it's not bad at all.
No, but
really.
it's earthy and earthly. Definitely the dialogue. It's screamingly American dialogue and screamingly of that period. It's so colloquial in places that I think we found some of the expressions quite amusing, but that doesn't detract from the episode. I don't think it. It just for a story set on Mars, it grounds it. It tells you exactly in a very short order, in a very short episode of television, like what kind of characters these are, like what their backgrounds are, without having to really flesh that out.
Yeah.
And as you said, like you're given that setup straight away. They're here to prospect, and there's an interesting point of they weren't able to make it alone. They needed to take on some corporate money or corporate sponsorship. And I was wondering if you'd come across anything at all that might have made that a pointed comment from Hunter Lombino.
No, I don't think there's anything specific, but it certainly crops up in a couple of his other sci-fi things. Everything seems to be funded by someone. There's a few stories. I was going through a bunch of his sci-fi short stories, trying to see if I could find an equivalent for this story. And there's a handful of them that are all about where does the money come from. So although he'd been in the US Navy, which is obviously a national thing, he's clearly got his eye on the idea that industry is going to take over these things. But again, that's an American thing, isn't it? The idea of...
again, capitalism and prospecting and that, harkening back to that era.
It's almost like the railroad expansion and things like that,
exactly,
different companies and stuff like that. So before we get stuck in...
SpaceX.
SpaceX.
He was way ahead of his time.
Yeah. If only the people who were like these billionaires with all the technology and all the ideas weren't also the most repellent people on the planet.
Imagine.
Oh, imagine if just one nice person was a billionaire. Well, if they were a nice person, they wouldn't be a billionaire, would they?
No comment.
No, right. You're not telling me something I don't...
I'm wearing a threadbare cardigan, so I don't think I'm...
You only brought a Toblerone.
It was quite a large Toblerone.
It was very true. Anyway, before we get into the episode bit by bit, let's just talk a little bit about the main cast in here, because one of the reasons it's worth doing this episode is because the lead credited actor, he's the only one who's named in the little linking material, is Leslie Nielsen.
That's
and
right.
1952 is very early in his career. It's not his first screen credit by any means. He'd been in quite a few of these different one-off drama series, and he's in quite a few episodes of Tales of Tomorrow.
So roughly how old was he, or have you got that?
I haven't got that information, but I think he was probably only in his mid-20s.
He does look very youthful in this.
Yeah.
And his hair is not silver yet.
It's not. It's beautiful hair. Beautiful hair. Appears very nicely on television.
Lustrous.
Yes. He was in 6 episodes of Tales of Tomorrow. One called Ghostwriter, which please let that be about a ghost that writes. One called Another Chance, Appointment on Mars, the one we're talking about now. One called Black Planet, which sounds more like a blaxploitation sci-fi movie from the 70s.
That I would like to see.
Yeah, it would be brilliant. And a 2-part adaptation of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Wow.
Because sometimes they adapted established, quite well-known things
right.
like Frankenstein.
There's an episode of Frankenstein which I'd like to see. I do want to watch more of these.
Which has Lon Chaney in it or someone like that.
Well, that's good casting.
Something like that, anyway. But this is his only science fiction role before he gets Forbidden Planet a few years later. And it's essentially the same sort of role, isn't it?
He's the captain of a ship. Yeah. I think they're quite different in the sense that, again, this guy's Robbie, Captain Robbie in the Appointment on Mars is very blue collar, whereas in Forbidden Planet it's part of a sort of established Earth, essentially kind of Starfleet type of military-ish united thing. Yeah.
I'd love to know if his doing Appointment on Mars had any sort of impact on him becoming involved with Forbidden Planet.
I think it would be very easy for a producer to have seen that and gone, oh, yeah, Leslie Nielsen's done sci-fi. I can see him as a captain.
That sort of presence.
Yeah, because he, in a way, he's like the super ego in this. He's trying to keep it all together when things do start to go sideways. Yeah.
And what's even better is, of course, he goes on to become one of the most famous TV detectives of all time.
Sherlock.
In the form of...
Oh.
I'm going to try again. In the form of Sergeant Frank Drebin, Detective Lieutenant, Police Squad.
That's right.
So he's in that world. This isn't comedy at all, though. This is before his comedy days, really. Because he's such a good straight actor as well. But
that's the thing, because basically when he works as a comedy actor, it's because he's a good serious actor. He's deadpan.
Yeah, he's deadpan to the nth degree. And as we were discussing before we started, probably in his later career, that's what makes it a bit boring, because everyone knows what they're getting. And once you've gone past the point where he's really brilliant with it, like Airplane and Police Squad and Naked Gun and one or two of the later ones, it gets a bit much that he's so deadpan that he's not actually acting anymore.
And there's a lot of low budget parodies on parodies on parodies that we briefly looked up and felt slightly sorry for him, because I've got such an enormous amount of sort of warmth when I think of Naked Gun and Leslie Nielsen as a comedy actor, but also from Forbidden Planet as well.
Yeah.
And I reminded you about him appearing as a recurring character in Due South as one of the head Mounties. And he just has this incredible charisma. And I think it's a shame that he went from leading man. And then I do think that those roles, which are iconic comedy roles, will have damaged his ability to get taken seriously as a serious actor after that point in dramatic productions. Because I can't really think of anything that he did subsequent to Naked Gun where he appeared, in a non-comedy role, and that seems like a shame to me.
An episode of Columbo.
Good God.
Which I can't remember what it is now, and that's going to really annoy me. I wish I'd checked in on that, because I've definitely seen it. Put a pin in that. Okay. Other people in the cast, the other two people in the cast, we've got a guy called William Redfield, who had almost exactly the same career path. If you look at their credits on IMDb, same sort of shows, same sort of TV productions, presumably the same sort of background. But he had a science fiction high point because he played the Captain Bill Owens, in Fantastic Voyage in 1966.
Okay.
Which is
with Raquel Welch.
Well, it used to be on every bank holiday. It was one of those ones that had come around on a long weekend in the UK on Channel 4 in the afternoon or something like that.
But it's not Bill Owen from Three Men in a Bath.
Last of the Summer Line.
Last of the Summer Line.
No, it's not.
Captain Bill Owen with his rope belt.
I'm glad you've got a bit of British TV ephemera in there for our long-time listeners.
I know you enjoy that.
Yeah, Captain Bill Owens. So that's William Redfield. He's one of the main three characters. Only three characters. And then we also have Brian Keith, who had a very similar career to the others. I mean, these guys are almost exactly the same career path. But he didn't do any big science fiction films. But he did play the dad in the original version of The Parent Trap.
Oh, okay.
Where Hayley Mills plays opposite Hayley Mills as twins, I think, in that one. One of those Disney live-action things. And that's
probably on Disney Plus now.
Probably is on Disney Plus with The Mandalorian, a programme I'm clearly never going to get to see.
Next year.
Anyway, producer, Mort Abrahams, he's a big name as well. He produced Planet of the Apes.
Oh, yeah, wonderful.
And Beneath the Planet of the Apes.
Okay.
And, well, yeah, all right. Diminishing returns.
Less good.
Well, Beneath's not too bad, I think.
It's got some charm to it. There's a really good Futurama joke inspired by it.
Indeed there is. But he also produced The Man from U.N.C.L.E.
Oh, okay.
So he had a very good set of credits. Those are some of the ones that most people would have heard about. And the director, Don Medford, well, now we're talking. This is a man who directed episodes of Dr. Kildare, The Fugitive, Police Story. Hold your horses. He directed episodes of Mrs. Columbo.
Oh, my word.
The Kate Mulgrew...
Captain Janeway.
The Captain Janeway weirdness thing.
Spin-off.
That wasn't actually a spin-off from Columbo because they kept trying to distance it from the original character as it went along. He did some episodes of The Fall Guy, Airwolf, Dynasty, and...
All the big names.
The Twilight Zone.
Oh, my word.
So he did a few episodes of The Twilight Zone as well. So there's
It's a very varied TV career. He's a consummate TV director then, wasn't he?
But it does establish this programme as being part of that tradition of establishing TV in that certain way, using these sorts of people who went on to have these careers. They could go into any sort of TV repertory company type situation.
Yeah, well...
As crew or cast.
One of the things I was going to mention to you, or discuss with you, is the place of sci-fi in the early 50s. And when we're dealing, obviously, with TV as a medium, we're still talking fairly early days for television. But sci-fi was extremely popular at that point. It appeared in weekly, monthly periodicals or short stories, but it did have this slightly tarnished reputation as well as of being something that was somehow juvenile or not to be taken as seriously as literature with a capital.
Well, genre fiction is the big thing, really, and it's the brush that, say, Ed McBain was tarred with for years, because detective stories, police stories are genre fiction,
same kind
not
of thing.
literature.
Pulp, yeah.
And it comes out of the pulp tradition of these magazines and the other types of pulp publishing, which is these cheap paperback books, these garish, brilliant, silly detective stories, lots of scantily clad women in jeopardy on the front.
Spicy detective stories.
And then all the sci-fi world of it as well, which I know we both love. And I find myself addicted to buying these cheap sci-fi paperbacks, which I will very often not read, but I will buy because the cover looks so good.
Yeah, beautiful, like artifacts of a forgotten age, really.
But actually, they're probably more significant in the establishment of the type of entertainment we enjoy now than any big literature of that period was.
Yeah, or the really popular genres that were being pushed then, such as westerns.
Yeah.
And even, Tarantino kind of takes a bit of a stab at that with his most recent film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, with the idea of, slightly later, but the idea of spaghetti westerns coming in, and that idea of exploitation cinema, but within the genre of the western, and westerns being typically sort of very sort of American thing, but American sci-fi of this point is really a very interesting prospect.
It is, and a lot of it's off the back of World War II as well, and rocket development, and the fact that Werner von Braun is brought over to the States to develop this next stage of space exploration for the US to try and win this space race with Russia. And obviously the imaginations of people are going wild over all of this stuff.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing with 50s sci-fi, American sci-fi. There's almost always a Cold War element to it. There's always a paranoia element, and that's certainly true of Appointment on Mars. Yeah. Although it's not necessarily, I don't think, related to the Cold War, or it's done in a very oblique way.
I think the thing it always was that they needed an enemy.
Yeah.
So these stories, especially sci-fi, which are frontier stories, are very often about, well, what if we butt up against an enemy here? And if this enemy is... We don't know anything about this enemy. They're unseen. They may be powerful. They might have this skills, which is basically, we're scared of communists.
Yes.
In so many cases, basically. So I'll tell you what. Let's stop talking about the broad world of science fiction and start talking specifically about this episode of TV by S.A.Lombino.
Appointment on Mars, starring Leslie Nielsen.
Sponsored by C H Maslan, who are still... trading today.
That's one of the questions I was going to ask you.
Yes, you can buy a C H Maslan carpet today.
And is it still $8.49 per square yard?
I suppose it depends on what type you get. Are you going to buy the Spindrift cotton carpet or Cantata with a Wilton weave?
Well, I was more interested in the Spindrift because of its deep pile and plasticised backing.
Plasticised backing, I think is probably very good. I think everything should be plasticised on the back and it would all pass smoothly over each other.
Like water off a duck's back.
Yeah. I do like to plasticise wildfowl at any point.
I recently had to hold the neck and body of a duck because an angler at a local park, Greenbank Park, had accidentally hooked a duck, a real one, not in a carnival. And I had to help him to try and disgorge his hook, which unfortunately he was unable to do. But I was on the bank of Greenbank Park, almost falling in as this was happening, and there was blood coming out of the duck's mouth. And a duck is quite strong, it turns out, and if it flaps its wings, you really can't hold on to it very well. And then I told this story to my dad, and he told me how to hold a duck, and I don't know where he got that information from.
There's a whole backstory to your father's duck handling abilities.
That's right.
You really need to get on tape.
When we make a connection to Evan Hunter, I'll bring that story back.
Yeah, blimey. Well, I didn't know where that story was going, that anecdote, and
the duck lived.
I hope so.
We went back the next weekend,
and it was still there.
We counted the ducks, and there were the same number of white ducks.
So that one with blood all down its neck, still there.
The Phantom of the Opera duck was there, yeah.
Well, there's a lesson there about fishing gear, isn't there? Really?
Yes.
Which you might have bought your fishing gear from C H Maslan, as it turns out that they make that as well. They just drop that in at the end of their advert. It's like, makers of fine carpets and hunting and fishing gear.
Hunting and fishing clothes, that's right, yeah.
Anyway, let's get away from carpets. We open on Mars. We're not getting there, we're already there. It's a little tent in a studio on a sort of barren Martian landscape. I say barren, except there's quite a lot of rocks and plant life. There is
plant life, and that's a plot point early on. Bart, the superstitious scientist, does talk initially about chlorophyll content before he is shushed by Jack, who's a sort of big bruiser of a man, and told, oh, Professor, we don't need to hear the
So
science.
Can we establish their characters? Leslie Nielsen, who
is Captain Robbie.
Captain Robbie he's a captain in the sense that he flies the ship.
Yes,
so he's the only one who knows how to fly the ship.
And that's really important later. Jack is a sort of just angry man. And I suspect that a lot of his dialogue was inspired by the naval background and did you say Bronx background? Yeah, of Lombino, because he's quite a bruiser of a guy. He's quite crude and straightforward.
He's there as the muscle. He's like a miner,
or
something like that.
If you could form testosterone into just the shape of a man, it would be Jack.
Yeah.
And then superstitious scientist Bart,
who's described as a little weed, sort of.
yes,
so he's not that small. That's the thing.
No, he's just not as imposing or as tall as the other two actors, really. But yeah, he initially talks about the flora of Mars and wonders why, if there's comparable plant life, why there are apparently no higher forms of life. Well, now they've landed on the planet with its whooshing winds.
Yes, it's very windy on this planet, isn't it?
It reminded me of Alien, how windy it was. It's maybe not quite as windy as Alien.
The great thing about that scientist is he gets all the close-ups, basically, because he's the one who's first affected by what I suppose we could call Mars madness.
Paranoia, yeah.
He does have one of the great lines in there, and he's trying to explain why he feels a bit weird on this planet, and he does say, "I don't know, it's weird." Thanks, scientist.
Yeah, he also it's very quickly established that they're going to be prospecting for minerals, and he just stands up and says, "I don't think we're going to find many minerals at all." And they say, "Why not?" And he says, "It's just a feeling." Which is, of course, the way scientists think and act.
Yes, absolutely.
See Prometheus.
Let's not see Prometheus. Not again. But I like the way it opens with the two of them, not Leslie Nielsen. The two of them, they are running around a bit like kids on a day out.
Yeah. There's a real kind of Boy Scout, sort of just silly, juvenile, teenage boy, adolescent.
The first people on Mars, they're all giddy and they're literally pushing each other over, and it looks like they're fighting, but it's not. They're just joshing.
Yeah, and could be considered a clever bit of foreshadowing.
It is. I think it is a clever bit of foreshadowing.
The two of them having this apparently antagonistic relationship, and Leslie Nielsen as Captain Robbie being the one that breaks it up, very much immediately, within seconds, actually establishes the dynamic of those three characters.
Yeah, definitely. What I do like about it is they're on Mars. They've got no protective gear on. They've got some nice sort of one-piece boiler suit spacesuits on.
It's very quickly established that they can breathe.
Yeah, so they're outside a tent, which is literally a little pyramid-type tent of the classic variety. And Leslie Nielsen, the captain, is like, "We're at Mars, everyone, so tell you what, I made a point of bringing this because weight and payload makes no difference in this world. Some crates of beer."
Yeah, and they're very excited to have some beers. And I suppose really it's all downhill from there.
Well, the evils of drink.
The temperance, sponsored by Masland and the temperance movement.
Yeah, the science fiction temperance movement of America.
So there is this really sort of quaint campsite on a sound stage, and it's the one set, and it's filmed live as you established before. And a lot of comments again online are about the low budget, but for 1952, I think with a low budget, Don Medford actually uses some really varied shot types and things to get the best out of that limited budget and limited setting.
Given that we in the UK, 11 years later than this, were getting Doctor Who, which wasn't broadcast live but was filmed as live, essentially, was probably comparable, if not slightly lesser in standard in many respects, for how that was shot in the initial things. It's just had a longer prep time, I think, really. But it's exactly the same system of you have a bank of cameras, you have a simple sets, and you've got to hit your marks and you've got to get your people there. Given that this was 1952, not 1963, I think they do really, really well. And there's only one or two moments where you're totally taken out of it because it's clear that the restrictions of the studio are...
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where suspension of disbelief and just going along for the ride of a half hour, basically play for today, comes in. But yeah, there are, as you said, there's some really good close-ups and extreme close-ups on Bart.
Some very good eye acting.
Sideways eye
acting.
He's got these really great in black and white, he's got these really good dark eyes, and he does seem really perturbed, and you get the sense that something is afoot.
Yeah. Well, talking about foots, the scientist, as all scientists do, is carrying a rabbit's foot with him.
Yes, that's correct. Betsy.
Which is, well, this is one thing.
Heavens to Betsy.
Heavens to Betsy, indeed. Because if you're going to take a rabbit's foot with you, I don't know, does everyone name their rabbit's foot? Or was that the name of the rabbit from which it was cut? Oh, my rabbit Betsy's died. I better take a foot. Is the foot the same as the hole? Does it retain the name? Or should it just be called Bet?
That's an excellent set of questions.
Well, I know. But anyway, the point is the scientist is shown to be not a cynic, but he questions things in a very unscientific way, and he carries a rabbit's foot, which he really puts a lot of faith into, although we don't get any actual faith.
Yeah, that's right. He's got a real
superstitious.
Yeah, definitely superstitious, and he that again, just like with the pistols, almost like Chekhov's pistol, you've got a very clear sense that each object that appears is going to be fairly significant. I guess other than the beer, because the beer is just something that I think establishes them, as I said before, like a kind of blue collar type, as opposed to sort of military, or not that the military wouldn't drink, but the first thing that they do is set up camp and have a beer together. You get the sense that they're not particularly professional.
Well, you assume that once they're having a beer, you assume it's like, well, we'll have a beer around the campfire tonight and then we'll get started in the morning. But no, they have a beer and then it's like, oh, should we get to work then?
Now let's go hunt those minerals.
And they're off. So they go off with a Geiger counter, essentially. So they've landed. They're the only people on Mars, as far as they know. There's 3 people from Earth, first ever people on Mars. This huge planet, 34 million miles away, we're told, which we did check on. And it is possible that at a certain point, Earth and Mars would only be 34 million miles away.
Yeah,
but on average, it's much further.
Perhaps it would make sense that if you're not terribly confident in the technology, that you would aim it to work within that window, when it's the shortest distance.
I assume they've got fuel for another 34 million miles.
They might have to wait a while for that alignment.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Actually,
they'd probably have to have more. I don't think.
I hope they've got some sort of almanac with them, some sort of Mars almanac,
or just lots of fuel.
Yeah, but anyway, they think they're the only people on Mars, as far as we know, and their plan is to scan it by hand with Geiger counters for minerals.
That's something.
The entire place.
Something I pointed out to you as we watched, and I said, "Oh, gosh, it would take them an awfully long time, wouldn't it?"
It definitely would. It definitely would. But they start, and the great thing is, within minutes, we assume from the storytelling, they discover that Mars is made of solid uranium, more or less. Or they find a seam of it.
Awful lot of uranium. Bart follows a vein of it for some amount of time, but it is the same day, and then it hits pay dirt, and they're really giddy and happy because it's going to make even paying half to the corporate sponsor. The Standard company, fuel company, they're going to make their fortunes on this. So it's paid off. They really good,
better than they could have imagined, basically.
Yeah, capitalism wins.
Yeah, so nothing could go wrong from here.
So at the end,
yeah, well, that was fun, wasn't it? Anyway, the point is, at some point, the one real production error is a point where a camera pans up too high and we see the studio ceiling and the cyclorama curtain around, which is a shame, really, because that's the only real big thing that takes you out of the story.
Yeah, because we were talking about this before, and someone online again points out that later on there's a prop doesn't work the way it's supposed to, but actually some clever acting, some clever ad-libbing in some way perhaps adds to the drama of that. And I think possibly there's a fluffed line. However, that happens when one of the characters, again, Bart, is being in quite a heightened emotional state, is being paranoid, and it actually works with the character's state of mind at that time.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is really the only mistake that does sort of take you out the world of Mars.
The world of Mars.
The world of Mars.
So it goes along quite nicely. They found this. They're very happy because if they can map this seam, they can tell their sponsor that Mars is full of uranium. They can take loads of it back because there's nothing wrong with a rocket ship full of uranium, I'm sure.
No, absolutely not.
Plunging towards Earth at faster than light speeds or whatever.
And they also, they literally then set about staking their claim.
Well, this is one of my favourite things, is they're hammering in a little marker point, marker 3, I think it is, and it's a little wooden stake, and they're hammering it in, and it takes two of them the best part of 5 minutes to carry on hammering this stake in with a lump hammer. And at that point, the stresses of Mars seem to be getting to them. So Bart and Jack are together, and they start to snipe at each other. They start to get bad.
Yes.
The wind is torturing them a little bit, and
Jack. It's the isolation because the ostensibly they're on a planet and there are only 3 people on that planet, and we'll never be in that situation. So there's this wonderful sense of isolation on a more or less barren world, and Jack develops a headache.
Yeah,
and he's never had a headache before, presumably because he doesn't have a brain. He's just all solid muscle.
Isn't there an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation where Picard gets a headache, and it's like, we eliminated headaches centuries ago or decades ago?
Yeah, he has a very minor headache.
So we haven't got any paracetamol because we don't need them.
I'm not sure, I might be wrong here, but that might also be the episode where they established that the common cold was cured many years before as well.
Yes, it's quite an early one, I think. Anyway, that's by the by.
Which would actually be detrimental were they to face the Martians from War of the Worlds.
Oh, I'm not talking about War of the Worlds at the moment. The BBC is currently showing an adaptation of War of the Worlds that's been much anticipated. The final part is on tonight. I am currently rereading the book out of spite at this TV adaptation, so we'll not get into War of the Worlds.
I've only seen half of the first episode and I'm quite enjoying it.
Well, you do you.
Yeah. Well, I think part of the novelty is that living in Liverpool, there's a lot of Liverpool filming involved, so it's almost like there's a sort of Where's Wally element of, oh look, there's St George's Hall, oh look, Formby Woods, and it really, the filming and stuff really does look pretty cool.
Yeah, and that's nice if you live in Liverpool, as we do, and you can enjoy that aspect of it. If you are just like the story War of the Worlds, then it's a different matter. We're not talking about it. We're talking about Appointment on Mars. They start to argue, it says in my notes here, which they do.
That's correct.
They start to argue. And
have we?
Appointment in podcast studio. They start to basically come to blows, and the 3 of them eventually are sort of like the captains try to manage these 2 guys who are being sort of becoming more and more paranoid. The big guys,
more and more
threatening the little guy. The little guy's becoming really sort of insular and frightened. And then we learn they've got guns.
Yeah, and just when this is happening, the spark point, if you like, is that Bart's lucky rabbit's foot Betsy has gone missing. So he naturally thinks that it's Jack kind of tooling with
the only other person there.
And Jack is already feeling, physically unwell. So that just antagonises him further. So it just kind of spirals. And at this point, Leslie Nielsen's Captain Robbie's the only one who seems to be keeping a level head.
Yeah. Or is he? There's a nice edit point, as you pointed out, where Leslie Nielsen's got this
tapping the Geiger counter, and there's a nice pan down and a close up of that, and then it switches to Jack and Bart, and where they're hammering with the lump hammer. Yeah, I thought that was a really neat transition
for a live TV thing. That's nicely faded, nicely edited, and they've worked that out, and that works really, really well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's a clue to how good this is for the time, really,
and also
given the constraints.
Again, the hammer itself, as a prop, again, then takes on another significance. It's used again. It's very, very sparing use of any props that the characters actually interact with, but each one is, like I said, other than the beers, actually come back and are really kind of important to what happens.
Yeah, and we get to a point whereby we know that everyone's antagonised, tempers are high, and then advert break.
That's right.
Or we move to the sponsor, and the nice man tells us all about C H Maslan's...
Cantata.
No, Spindrift, the first one.
Damn it, it was Spindrift.
At $8.49 a square yard.
Ah, yes, $8.49.
Lovely cotton carpet, which means they can dye it in many, many colours.
Yeah,
unlike the other ones.
It holds the dye, and that's unique to cotton carpets.
Definitely, and the plasticised backing will stop you sliding around. I'm not entirely sure.
It might have hindered me holding that duck.
It would have done, but yeah. So and then that's if anything's going to take you out the world that you've been sort of invested in for the last 14 minutes, it's suddenly a man stood in front of a wall made of carpet telling you about carpet. But he does that for 2 minutes, and then he hands you back to Mars.
He does, and it's done in a nice theatrical way. And now we return you to the program. Leslie Nielsen in Appointment on Mars, and again, I there's something really quaint and direct and honest about it being a TV production, instead of trying to kind of really over-egg the pudding and create something, totally fancy in the way that, programs now, very high budget and all of these things. And there's something really just beautiful and honest about that.
It's nice. But what I like is when they return to the story, we have an echo of the first scene, as you talked about foreshadowing before. So in the first scene of the entire thing, it's Jack and Bart sort of playfully pushing each other around, joshing. This time we cut back, they're fighting this time, but they're not joshing now, they're actually fighting, they're pushing each other around. And I think it's a very clever little directorial storytelling touch as well, which is nice. So we come back and they're fighting, and the captain wisely says, "Look, we can't have this. Give me your weapons."
Yeah, he admonishes them in a very sort of level-headed way. He says, "You're acting like kids." To which Jack basically replies, "He started it," which I thought was a great piece of dialogue, actually.
Yeah, it's nice. And Jack is determined that he's going to be taught how to fly the rocket home. He wants to be told so he can leave and just get out of there. And Leslie Nielsen's like, "This is stupid. It would take months for me to teach you how to fly a rocket. Not only the controls, but then you'd have to learn," and it's a great portmanteau word, astrogation.
I did, yeah, I winced at that, and I saw you writing it down, because I'm pretty sure that would be astronavigation.
Yeah, I think that's what it is.
And he's.
But I like the idea that they've gone, well, if it was a common enough thing, it would be
astrogation.
Yeah, astrogation. It's astral navigation. It's not navigation on Earth. So that's fair enough, isn't it?
It's a word that I think we'll start to use more and more.
Yeah, as SpaceX
in our day-to-day lives.
Yeah,
in this 21st century.
Although, of course, when people were going over to find America, as one white man once did, apparently, or they would have used astral navigation then, wouldn't they? Because they used the stars.
The stars, yeah. You're right, yeah.
Perhaps
with a sextant,
Christopher Columbus was maybe using the word astrogation then.
We'll bring it back.
Yeah, we'll get it in.
So one note I did make about possibly a budgetary constraint, but I think also just from a directorial point of view, is how close... I've written down how close the tents are, but I clearly don't mean that. I mean how close the little beds are that they sleep on. And it's so that they can do a physical pan across the three characters as they go to sleep.
So it's obviously hot on Mars because they decide the way they're going to deal with all this stuff is it's bedtime.
Yeah, that's basically they.
Leslie Nielsen is dad, and he puts his kids to bed.
So I think we've skipped the basically that fight is a fight with a hammer as well.
Yeah.
Which when I first watched this, I was really surprised because for 1952, attack with lump hammer on live television, I thought was really quite violent and daring.
Well, it's on Mars; it's all right.
Yeah, it's far enough removed. But yeah, so they put to bed, and then the next morning they wake up, and
something wakes up the scientist.
Bart is woken up.
Something's got to him.
He seems a bit twitchy,
and so he decides he can see Martians. He's looking around, he can see Martians, so he starts firing randomly into the landscape.
Immediately begins firing, because when Leslie Nielsen tries to get those pistols off the other two men, Bart refuses, and then Jack, I think in fairness, rightly says, well, you're not having my pistol because he's still got his.
Yeah, but if that was the case, there would be no disarmament ever.
Isn't that America now?
Well, it's most of the world, really, isn't it? So you've got a guy, he's randomly firing, so obviously this wakes up the other two as well. And
you would wake up if you were so close to someone that you could accidentally touch the face, as Leslie Nielsen does when he's asleep.
Like tender.
A tender smack in the face. Yeah. Immediate pistol firing based on suspicion of possibly imaginary Martians at that stage, and that not arouses the other two, and yes, Leslie Nielsen tussles with Bart, and in that ensuing fracas, Bart is wounded and sure to die, and he does
mortally wounded.
He expires. He is an ex-astronaut.
He is run up the curtain and gone to join the choir invisible. And this obviously freaks out Jack, who is still paranoid, and figures out in his little tiny pea brain, oh, it was your plan all along, Captain, wasn't it? You were going to kill both of us and then go home. Well, I'm not going to allow that, matey. That's why you wanted our guns. Ha 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 ha. I figured it out. Then it comes down.
And he's very sweaty at that stage as well. Yeah, I think that's really well done, because you can see that there's something quite wrong. And one of the things I thought about was was it written in a way that the more cerebral character of Bart had this kind of suspicion all along, but then the character of Jack being physical had that kind of physical discomfort. So it's sort of playing on different levels, you know.
Ooh, that's a nice way of thinking of it.
You've got the cerebral guy, you've got the muscular guy, and then you've got the rational captain who tries to sort of steer them clear, but falls foul of.
But basically, we're left with Robbie and Jack, and they don't tussle to start with. It becomes a gunfight because they both still have guns, and Jack tries to get Robbie to take him to the shuttle to tell him how to the rocket to tell him how to fly it home, and a gunfight ensues, except that one of the guns fails. Yeah, on set.
So this is potentially the prop that doesn't work. The Leslie Nielsen's pistol doesn't fire, but he, having been shot in the stomach, he crawls over to Jack and throttles him in a sort of interestingly awkward way. I've never seen anyone throttled in real life, but even on film, it's a very unusual way to throttle someone. And so the three men are dead, and so really you'd think that was the end of the episode. And in some ways, I kind of wish it was.
Well, before we get on to how it actually ends, I will say that I was once in a play on stage, and I had to fire a gun. And the gun that we had, the prop failed, so that the caps inside it didn't go off. And I didn't have to throttle anyone, but I did have to improvise and ended up throwing the gun somewhere. I can't remember how that helped. The gun had to end up underneath a drinks trolley or something. But yeah, it didn't go off, so I had to improvise. So I understand.
Unlike in John Wick, where you'd have just thrown the not working gun at someone as a weapon.
So hard it would kill them.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it does. So we've got 3 dead Earthmen on Mars, and the camera pulls out as far as it can pull out without revealing the rest of the set. And we get the voiceover from the 2 Martians who've been observing this all along, and in fact affecting actions on Mars.
That's right. They've been somehow the word invasion is used. They've been invading the human minds, and the weedy little one, as they refer to him as the scientist Bart, was the most easy to coerce. But eventually they all succumbed to this paranoia and
in fact, they stole the rabbit's foot. So these are very mysterious, invisible Martians that can take things.
Possibly corporeal, but unseen observers. The irony of an unseen observer, of course, being kind of interesting. All eyes, but invisible. But yeah, they're never seen. They do refer to one another by name, and it is a little bit hammy for me.
Yeah. Because, well, there's a lot I love reading sci-fi short stories where people have to come up with names for people on other planets, and they're always called something like Klek and Narn.
Rom.
And Grap.
Oh, no, that's a bad one, because he was in Deep Space Nine, and he was a great character.
That's what it is.
Roll.
But the punchline is basically these Martians going, do you think they'll send more people? And it's like, not now. Oh, my voice went funny then. I was possessed by a Martian briefly.
You did sound quite Martian. But yeah, ultimately they decide to take a look. They don't say, let's take a gander over there at the spaceship. But essentially they do that in a slightly more Martian accent. It's more American Martian accent.
Well, the implication, accent or otherwise, is that they're going to seize the humans' rocket ship and use it
presumably to go to Earth and spread paranoia, and that's the only
communists again.
The only kind of Cold War paranoia connection I can make to this.
But the rocket, as we are told in the closing credits, was provided by the American Rocket Society plus Reaction Motors. You actually see the rocket just in the background of a couple of shots.
Yeah,
the fact that it got its own credit.
You asked how big I thought the rocket was, and I hadn't even realised it wasn't just part of the matte painting, to be honest.
Yeah, well, it was given its own special spoken credit at the end.
It's given in the background.
Forced perspective?
Yeah, it gives you a sense of scale and perspective, yeah.
Right, okay. Well, we've got to the end of that piece of madness, so we need to sort of sum up really here. But before we do, I will ask you, as a sci-fi fan, what's your favourite Martian thing? And you can't just say Mars.
I was going to say to you also, who's my favourite Martian? Haha, joke. So I was thinking about this type of sci-fi that's fairly, other than that twist that I personally think detracts from the story of isolation and paranoia and what greed and stuff can do. I think there have been several stories like this, and even recently, things like Andy Weir's The Martian, which is a very grounded survival story set on Mars. I haven't seen Ad Astra, but I think there's more grounded elements in it.
I've not seen either of these. I've definitely not seen The Martian.
The Martian is wonderful. It's about...
Oh, not you too. I'm sure it is wonderful. Gary was banging on about it in one of our episodes about one of the other sci-fi stories that Evan Hunter wrote, and it was his main reference point, and it started to drive me mad by the end because I've not seen it, and I've still not seen it.
It's an unusual science fiction story because it is all essentially based on, I assume, fairly factual elements of a man trying to survive. So it's almost like a Robinson Crusoe type of thing. If Robinson Crusoe was growing potatoes. Okay,
well that's something I didn't know about it.
It's good. It's worth watching.
He's dropped the potato spoiler.
Oh, sorry. And then, so yeah, if you're looking at, and again, the 50s sci-fi is all over the map because you do get some of these quite fairly realistic, although yes, the atmosphere of Mars and plant life and stuff isn't correct. But this idea of a grounded kind of, we get to Mars and this little story happens. I do have a soft spot for the War of the Worlds Martians, but in the American production.
That. I like the famous American film.
The non-tripods, the ones that fly and make the wonderful noise.
As the Wonderful Noises of War of the Worlds by Jeff Wayne.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I do love War of the Worlds. It's actually a fantastic story. I'm just disappointed with this current adaptation, and it took so long to turn up. And I'm not going to say heartbreaking because I don't care that much, but it's annoying that they can miss out on some very simple, good sci-fi storytelling for the sake of weird flash forwards. So
I like the Martian Manhunter in DC Comics, although he's kind of a slightly second string character. He's got kind of too many powers. He can phase through things, and his only weakness is fire. But he's used in a couple of stories really nicely. And he can change shape and like turn into different people and pretend to be a human and stuff. How about you? Who's your My Favorite Martian?
I lose track of what's where in the universe, really, because it sort of doesn't matter. Maybe my favourite Martian thing is Mars, Bringer of War by Gustav Holst from The Planets.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is a massively significant piece of music, influencing, as it did, more or less every bit of sci-fi music for the entirety of the 20th century.
Yeah, it's a pretty much a staple on Classic FM as well.
I love Classic FM. If I put Classic FM on while we're in the car, as we often do, I'm guaranteed that I will get some sort of John Williams superhero theme tune or like action theme tune within about 3 plays of anything on Classic FM.
It's pretty much Jurassic Park, Holst, or Carnival of the Animals.
Anyway, we need to sum up here. We need to give this a score because we give everything a score,
yes.
And we need a unit to measure it by out of 100. So
it's a difficult one because we when you're not in a series, this is difficult because of relativism.
Well, this is a one-off. We just judge it on its own merits and the merits of C H Maslan's carpets.
Shall we give it? What like how many Maslans out of
a weave density?
A weave density.
How
well woven is the tale?
Yeah.
It's given it in its own sort of context of 1952. Again, still fairly early TV stuff. Anthology show, so they couldn't reuse sets, and 3 or 4 Maslans out of weave densities out of Masland.
Well, it needs to be out of 100, so scale it.
Oh, it's out of 100.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, 70.
70 weave density of 70.
A weave density of 70. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I agree with you. I think it's very interesting. These anthology TV series where every episode is different, more or less. Mm-hmm. There's a certain amount of repertory cast, but that doesn't matter because we're just looking at the one episode. It's nice to see Leslie Nielsen early on, and he's... The other thing that they must have taken to Mars, other than beer, is like buckets and buckets of Brill cream.
Oh yeah, everyone's
hair. And Leslie Nielsen's hair, so shiny, shiny, that hair on Mars.
Very jealous. And maybe it was all of that turned his hair silver, characteristically silver later in his career.
Indeed. It's very interesting in terms of its relationship to S.A.Lombino, Evan Hunter, Ed McBain's career. I think it's really fascinating, especially if you've read any of his other short stories, because his entire career is propped up on short stories and being able to sell them to sci-fi magazines, to detective magazines, to sports magazines in some cases, Western magazines. This is really interesting. There are things, if you want to look, like I've suggested, about the dialogue and things like that, that point to a future direction. I think it's good. I'm going to go for a 70 as well, which gives it 70.
Oh, that's very good.
That's the answer. It's scored 70. I think this might be our highest scoring spin-off. Oh. And to the untrained eye, it probably looks like the most cheesy and worst of them.
But it's got real charm to it. And you asked me earlier about my sci-fi credentials, if you like. I'm a huge fan of Kurt Vonnegut, and again, his career started with and was propped up by short storytelling, and he spoke a lot about how that craft helped him to develop as a writer and even as a teacher of writing. This episode is very taut. There's nothing there that doesn't need to be there, except in my mind that sort of slightly tacked on Martian thing, which if we had more information about the production and stuff, maybe that was something that was added in, or it just seems like, or perhaps because a lot of the Tales of Tomorrow do, subsequently the Twilight Zone had, relied on twist endings.
Yeah, it's a bit of an.
It does feel like, you know, it's you're led to believe one thing and then you're wrong-footed, and yeah, maybe it was trying to hit that twist ending.
I think so,
a little bit. Interestingly, Don Medford, of course, if he directed Planet of the Apes and Beneath the Planet of the Apes, two films that have fantastic twist endings. Actually,
good point. Actually, yeah.
And Planet of the Apes was written by Rod Serling. So there's that
adapted from a book by a Frenchman, though.
Pierre Boulle. Yeah. But that ending's complete. That's not in the novel at all. So Don Medford working with Rod Serling. That's it. You know, there's quite an interesting sort of.
No, it wasn't Don Medford who directed it. It was the producer, Mort Abrahams, who produced it.
Oh, sorry.
I think this is the same point still stands.
Yeah, sorry, that was me being not good.
Well, now you've embarrassed yourself.
My brain go wrong.
Well, there you go.
I blame it on my baby.
Yeah, I think you've done very well for a man with a five-month-old baby to manage to understand, to some extent, half an hour of TV from 1952.
I blame it on midichlorians, Paul.
Oh, dear me. And with that dreadful reference... I think it's time to finish. So I
thought you'd say Ice Warriors, Paul.
Oh, no.
To my favourite Martian, I've got to be honest.
They are very good Martians.
They're pretty good.
And they do hiss a lot. Big claw hands.
That's right.
Just hit my microphone stand there, sorry. I think it's time, anyway, Adam, for you to say to our listeners goodbye.
Goodbye, but please have me back. Bye. Goodbye.
And I will see you soon, everyone. Fare thee well.
So we end another Tale of Tomorrow, Appointment on Mars, starring Leslie Nielsen, and brought to you again by C H Maslan and Sons, makers of Maslan Beauty Blend broadlooms and authentic hunting and fishing clothes.